Okay. So I've summarised where we're heading with this particular talk today. Back in February, on February the 15th, we started our discussion with this well-known slide or quote from a fellow called Milton Friedman. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And at the time, I guess we were looking at the climate crisis and thinking there's an opportunity for change. But now, of course, we've got a very, very big one or two thrown into the mix. But Freeman's point is very true. You know, having alternatives on the table at the time that crisis hits makes the politically impossible become politically inevitable, as he said. So we weren't expecting this particular crisis, but we know there'll be plenty out there who'll be also working on ideas to sort of take advantage of the opportunity. Now, what is a Green New Deal? Let me just kind of give you an idea of what, the way I see it. It doesn't have a sort of dictionary definition, but it centers on fixing the environmental crisis. But what's a little bit different is that it says we should be fixing the other crisis of inequality as part of fixing that environmental crisis. In other words, we need to look at this as a linked up, joined up program of policies and activities that in the course of fixing the climate crisis will build the new fairer society that we need along the way. One of the other features of it is really an opportunity to talk once again about a scale of action and thinking that's really been absent from public discourse for quite some time. It's been and particularly when the scale of action and thinking is coming from the public sphere. There's kind of two types of approaches that we've been able to see overseas, and one of these is the European approach. And the Europeans, as we know, are very hot on these things. Their approach is more of a what you might call the regulatory state. It's incremental. They in fact call it a Green Deal rather than a Green New Deal, with to avoid the reference to the massive change in the US in the 30s, in the post-Depression 30s. They take a more incremental approach, and they are focused on mitigating the social harms that come about from those changes, which actually in itself, of course, is major progress from the 90s when our Rogernomics and the Thatcherism and so on of the early neoliberal area came in, made massive changes, and didn't bother too much about mitigating social harm. On the other hand, in the UK and the US, where we've seen the Corbynistas, and we've seen particularly Bernie Sanders and in fact actually several of the Democratic contenders, theirs is a much more ambitious Green New Deal. It's much more activist. It provides for a much more activist role for the state, and a transformational social agenda is thrown into the mix. It's about a transition to a green economy and society, but it's about major transformational change. So one of the questions we debated just a couple of months ago was, which approach should New Zealand take? And arguably, we're probably already taking the approach number one, but we certainly in our group came up very, very strongly that we should be following more of the activist transformational approach, and really using this opportunity to fix some long-term problems that need fixing. Giving an example of how these things play out, here's some policies that are or were, of course, because we're now perhaps a lot more alone in this than we were a few months ago as well. But a job guarantee, the Sanders campaign, guarantee everyone a stable job that pays a living wage, a guarantee. In the UK, a 4-day week, more time, give us more time, not more stuff. Give us, let's make a fundamental change to how we work, how we live, how we live our lives outside of work. that's, again, that was in there. Expanding the health and social care work. In other words, making those kind of trade-offs. Do we shift people out of retail and into, in terms of great economic shifts? Maybe we have fewer people in retail and more people in care professions, with all the social benefits that come from that, as well as potentially work benefits. In the, an EU comparable policy would be their just transition mechanism, again, a good bureaucratic rather than political term, which is a one-off $100 billion fund. That's about 0.5% of the EU's GDP, aimed at mitigating the harm as workers transition from those polluting or, sunset industries to the new green industries. So there's a conscious attempt to mitigate the harms of that disruption, but it's not what you'd call transformational. It's not embedding significant change in society. So here, I guess, is the question: what happens when we throw COVID-19 into this mix? Because even just a few weeks ago, we were looking at two crises: the environmental crisis and inequality. And now we've got four crises. Those first two didn't go away, and we've now got a crisis of health and an economic crisis on a scale that's probably we haven't seen possibly for a century, and certainly for decades. So the first thing I'd like us to have a think about and discuss is, based on the general principles of a Green New Deal approach to the environment and to social change as part of fixing the environment, is what has just happened the end of the Green New Deal? For example, can climate survive as the central crisis when all this other stuff is going around us? Is ambitious change, social change, still going to be viable, or are we going to retreat into business as usual as we've got our economy collapsing, businesses collapsing, jobs being lost? What is going to happen? And I'd like us to have a think about and share our collective thoughts on that, on that issue. Anyone like to toss in an idea? Gerald.
Martin.
Oh, sorry, Robert. Yep.
Well, I think things have changed, and one of the major causes of that is the amount of money that the government is putting in to shore up the existing ability for people out of job or to be out of job to survive. That's the social welfare net, if you like. But there's a whole series of other money that's coming. And I think that from my reading is that a lot of people are saying, let's make sure that that money actually goes towards the climate issues that are coming. That the kind of crisis that we're experiencing at the moment is actually peanuts by comparison with what's around the corner. So let's start using that money. And I think that's been a significant change over the last month or so. I think that the issue for me will be that the initial money is going just to keep people alive, those people whose income is stopped. And even though they're in really bad industries that are polluting the environment and so forth, protecting those people who need to. But the more important thing, I think, is actually setting up a process to help industry do the transition. And it's not just industry, it's civil society and government. All of those, all the economy at the moment are providing, are into climate damage of some kind or other. And so there's a real need, it seems to me, to actually help people through that transition. So one of these more specific policies that I would recommend is that government set up a transition unit which helps organisations measure their footprint, their social and their ecological footprint, and then starts to help them do the transition. The government has done a little bit of this in Taranaki with the oil industry, but it seems to me that there needs to be, through the Stats Department, the Ministry for the Environment, the Climate Commission, and so on, the various agencies that government has, to actually have a unit that defines actually what is the kind of social and ecological and economic standards, because there's a lot of rubbish that's talked about being socially responsible. So there needs to be clear standards, and there needs to be a unit that can actually work with companies and organisations to measure adequately their footprint, and then help them through that transition, some sort of transition package in some sort of way.
Thanks,
Now,
Robert.
a lot
Actually,
more
I recommend that that document you distributed to us as well a day or two ago on that, which included that area.
There's a lot more that I could speak about, but let me stop at that stage.
Thanks. Jill, you've had your hand up for a little bit.
Gerald.
Well, actually, it was Jill Ovens had, but sorry, yeah, and then Gerald.
Yeah, I'm here. I was just putting my thing on mute. So you asked the question, is it the end of the Green New Deal? Because we're now facing a major economic crisis, and people are describing it as a depression, or at least a recession. And I'm reminded that our great social welfare state came out of a depression and was the response to that. So I'm very positive about the lessons that we learned from the COVID lockdown with respect to both the economic situation and climate change. And what was remarkable was our response as a nation to the organisation of work. So we worked from home, we had meetings remotely, and in doing so, we not only reduced traffic on our roads, which was marvellous for Auckland and for the climate, but we also stopped flying around domestically and internationally. It showed that we could actually do things without flying around the place. So that was a major. I've been very concerned about the environmental impact of international tourism in New Zealand, and because we've got like 4 million tourists coming these days, that does have an impact on the environment, not just the fact that they're all flying to get here, but also, so yes, the tourism industry is going to be in a crisis, so we do need a just transition to redeploy those workers from the tourism and related industries. And I just remind you, because of what Robert was saying, that the unions have a major role to play in that. The other thing is, we showed that so many of our businesses are based around consumerism, and again, international transportation and infrastructure is needed to get all those products to New Zealand. And what the lockdown showed us is we can make things ourselves. Look at Kiwis rediscovering baking, sewing our own cloth masks, making those face shields locally out of photocopier things, or whatever, printers, I mean. And then just 3 more points. We showed the danger of over-reliance on globalization. Our supply chain, for example, for essential products such as pharmaceuticals. Remarkably, we expanded our welfare system to meet the needs of the sudden growth of number of people who have lost jobs. And now people are talking about a universal basic income as a very viable proposition. And finally, we showed that the slower pace of life, our connection with whānau, and the value of human friendship.
Sorry, I'm just listening to this. Yeah, thanks. Oh, great, thank you.
And so I think we should capture all these wonderful lessons that we learnt from this terrible situation, and show how they can affect positively on the environment, climate change, and the economic situation.
Thank you, Jill. Can I go to Gerald, who had his hand up earlier on, and then I see Matt's put his hand up.
Yes, hi Martin, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Very good.
I just made a couple of notes here to so I don't go off on a tangent, but basically I'm coming from monetary reform and the way government is funded. And I've just written a couple of notes since I've been listening to other speakers, and I've come up with just to start, virus equals opportunity for the Labour Party. And the virus, it's known that a virus can be started because of the low mood of people, i.e. poverty. So the virus could be, a reaction of how we've got so much inequality in the whole world today, that we've got, 1% filthy rich and the other 80% filthy poor. And this affects people's moods, and it also has a thing to do with these viruses and who set it off. Whatever happened, we don't know yet, but it has contributed to the way people are feeling. And I notice as I walk up and down New Zealand, I see people's faces in hardship in the streets. Now, the monetary reform and the way government is funded, I think, is the opening balance to all the problems, because you can't fix anything unless you've got funding, and that funding is available there through the Reserve Bank directly funding government. And that, to me, is where we have to start. And once we start with monetary reform and get the money and the funding right in place, then every other problem can be solved, strangely enough. Today, in the next few months, the Labour Party has the best opportunity ever to change monetary policy, and fast. The only way to stay ahead of the opposition is to implement change as fast as we can. The National Party is leaderless and on its knees, with an imminent change in leadership. Therefore, the time to move is now, and fast. So if there's going to be change made, it has to be done reasonably fast, but you can't exactly tell people exactly the ins and outs of things, because they won't believe it.
Yeah, thanks, Gerald. That's and actually that's an excellent point, because we're going to be picking up on that later on as well. So
yes.
That I think that's a very key point to cover off. Can I just go to Matt, who put his hand up?
I'm not quite. Can I just carry on for a bit?
Can I just come back?
Oh yeah, that's okay. Yep, no problem.
We need to get through a few things. Matt, are you still?
Thanks, Martin. You're on a roll, Gerald. I'll just make mine very brief. First of all, I think your question about whether you pursue addressing inequality in addition to a Green Deal or New Deal, I think, of course. They're both goals of the Labour Party, and rightfully. And so, yeah, you go for as much of both as you can get, I think. And then you see what happens in the political negotiations as to how much of each you can achieve. And I think, I know it comes later in your presentation, but creating the case for both, or creating solutions that address both, I think is a really interesting point of analysis. I think second of all, the question about, do you try for something now? I mean, the doors are wide open in terms of there being a need now for some major changes and action by government. And I think receptivity among the public for the kind of structural changes you're talking about. So it's a gift in a way. My questions would be around when it comes to framing the case, I think the questions are, what about the zero carbon bill? If there's a need for a sort of a Green New Deal, people may question, well, why isn't what we have already enough? Why isn't what we recently passed enough? And doesn't that represent the maximum of what was achievable at that time on a bipartisan basis anyway? And I'm not saying it does, but I'm saying that's an argument I think that needs to be counted. And the fourth thing is about, so everybody's going to be pushing now ideologically for the changes that they want to see. There's going to be I think a battle royale. And I think we're only just seeing the very early stages of that reflected in this, pressure on whether we should restart the economy or in part or not. Is it healthcare first or is it economic suffering first. But I just flagged that because I know the Greens are already pushing the case strongly for a large environmental component of any recovery package. So I think that, you know, some thinking around how to position the proposal next to or, you know, with that, I think would be useful.
Thanks, Matt. So, Emily, you had your hand up physically, and Joe's got a virtual hand up, and I think we'll move on after that.
Okay, I was just going to say, I'm Emily Henderson from Whangarei. I was just going to say, I don't think we can at all afford to lose sight of the environment and the need to push for environmental change in this crisis. I think people have been waiting. I think people have an opportunity here and are seeing an opportunity to live differently. The number of comments you see on good old Facebook about what I'm going to do in the new reality, what's going to be the new normal. Also, I have 4 teenagers in this house. And if we want to think about Labour long-term in purely self-interested terms, next election, my kids are not going to be voting for this Labour Party unless we prove our commitment to the environment. So we can't drop the ball here, guys. That would be my comment. So I talk everything everyone's said so far.
Thanks. That's great, Emily. Joe, and I'll there's quite a few hands up, but Joe, I'll take yours.
Hi everybody. Thank you, Martin. Just a couple of points I want to raise that people may not have considered is we can stop traveling, we can talk virtually and stuff. What about green alternatives to what we currently have? I know you can use green hydrogen to potentially come up with aviation fuel. And I know that people are looking at that right now. Other things, because many people on this Zoom call who have traveled extensively overseas, they have someone to live with. And there are other people who haven't had that opportunity yet to travel and perhaps live alone and have maybe found this lockdown a lot harder. So I'd like people to take that into account, that we need to maybe not go from one extreme to another in making these changes. And that's all I've got to say at this time.
Thank you very much, Joe. Well, actually, there's just take a couple more because keep things going. Bruce.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to just perhaps be a little bit radical. We are in a grave risk of reverting to business as usual because of the incredible success of the government in the way it's handled this crisis. Because there's a huge number of people who don't think there's a crisis anymore. And we've got the opposition saying, well, let's get back to business as usual. And if we're going to do this transformation of our society, as other speakers have pointed out, we have got to somehow or other galvanise people to realise that the crisis is not over. The crisis, the disease crisis is not over, nor is the environmental crisis over. In fact, the environmental crisis is beginning. And so we've got this, I would say it's a conflict, a clash, that we've been so successful, and that very success could undermine our resolve to make changes. That's all I need to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I'll take 2 more. One project. I'm not sure who that is, but your name's showing up as one project. You can change it, by the way. But would you like to? And I'll take.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Martin. Hello, everyone. No, I'm okay changing it. I think the name's quite nice. One project, we're in this together. And it was also the name of my first business, which put me out of business as a young 20-year-old. But hey, anyway, look, really like what everyone's saying, but I just did a talk at Tech Futures Lab on last Tuesday around this whole concept of business as usual. And I put the end part to that, you're kidding, right? Because unfortunately, what defines the way we live our lives and the behaviors that we all follow from a psychological perspective is the social narrative. So the social narrative plays out to be our social norms, which becomes our culture, and our culture becomes our behaviors. So as Jill was saying, unfortunately, that narrative is consumerism. And that narrative is presented to us by commerce, because neoliberal economics relies on consumerism.
Yeah.
And when you have $1 trillion a year, well, 683 billion, as studied by McCann in 2010, spent on advertising alone, the narrative has been hijacked to stay on the hedonic treadmill. It's not allowing us to progress to lives of meaning, lives of engagement. And that's the thing with this great pause that we saw with COVID-19. It allowed us the time to find those other spaces in our lives because it forced us to stop and get off that treadmill for a moment. So my concern, and this is what I spoke about to a lot of technology and technocrats and business people, is that when we look at who Paul Henry's speaking to, when we look at who the government is leaning into for what this new New Zealand looks like, it's the same people that had their ear, scientists, technologists, and businessmen and women that created the situation we're in to this point. So who do we lean into now for the vision of tomorrow? And I said we need to lean into the poets, the authors, the musicians, the healers, our kaumatua, our kuia, people who still embody what it is to have empathy and who still embody what it is to care. And they set the vision. Then it's the rest of us to actually come in behind with our technology, our science, our data, and our commerce to make that vision a reality. So those are some of the topics that I was putting out there. So is this an opportunity for more to be put on the table? Absolutely, because inequality, pathological loneliness, all those issues, and poverty, and I work with a lot of kids in South Auckland in another role I do. I see it daily, and you need to let the people at the coalface be heard. So if we want to change, we need a diversity of voice, and that diversity has to go wide to create a better tomorrow. So I think this is the time to do it. It's the silver lining in all of this, and that's all I have to say. So sorry about that.
Thanks a million. That's great. David, I'll just take that one more. David, you've had your hand up. David, are you there? No. Okay. What I might do is, Brett. Oh, sorry. There's David. I'll take David. Yeah.
Just skip it. Go on to the next.
Okay. A fuzzy internet there. Okay, Brett.
Testing.
Yes. So good morning. Been good listening to the comments. Look, from I live up in the Hokianga. My take on it is this presents an opportunity, a great opportunity. And I guess I worry that there are some out there who will see this as an opportunity to backpedal on a bunch of changes that should be being made on climate and any other front, arguing that the recovery requires money to be spent only in certain directions. I think it's an opportunity to rebuild with the climate and other matters in mind, and to be foremost in our thinking about decisions, that whole business of casting a climate lens over all the decisions that are made. And I think one of the answers there is about this whole business, which you've mentioned, Martin, and is out there, this whole business of linked policies. And I think that's critical to success. It seems to me there's an opportunity, coming right up with the Mark Binns led Infrastructure Council. Now, what's the government how are they going to approach that? Will they view that through a climate lens, a poverty lens, or any of the other lenses? Or is it just going to be monopolised by, I don't know, the roading industry? So I think there are opportunities there. And just quickly using climate as one, if for example, part of the climate change thing is about solar, and that obviously impacts on climate, then the linked things are around regional development and jobs, and not just jobs, but upskilling and increasing wage levels for skills, and also linking into small business. So with one policy, one can overtly and at a marketing level, political marketing level, push that this one activity, e.g. solar, can have so many benefits across the whole country. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett. Much appreciated. Okay, well, I'll, David, did you want to make your comment, or shall I move on to the next phase? I think you're having some technical problems there. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on. Thanks for those great contributions. I'm just going to do a quick screen share, so bear with me a moment. And then what I'm going to do in the next part of our discussion is to look at some of the specific policies that have been sort of proposed in Green New Deals internationally, and sprinkled with a little bit of what's come out of our own thinking over the past weeks. So I'm going to do a quick share and move on. Right. So before I do, I just always like to sort of keep a few basic numbers in mind as we're sort of having these discussions, because it just sort of helps to conceptualize some of the issues, some of the relationships, some of the challenges. So, and we all know these numbers are going to look very different. These were numbers that looked like they would be sort of incrementally different a few weeks ago. Many of them will look radically different. But as of 2019, and just in round numbers, our GDP is about $300 billion. So if it's a $3 billion program, that's 1% of GDP. About 90 billion of that is core government spending. And if you throw in the various government related businesses and this and that, it's another, 20 odd billion. Our import-export area, we're described as a trading nation, and in reality, both imports and exports are around 50 billion each. Obviously, usually there's more imports than exports, but in that order. So that is a sort of a sense of how that sector relates to our economy. And we know that two of those big export earners have taken an enormous hit. We also know that as we transition to a green economy, it's probable that one of the biggest import categories will take a big hit as well, which is those fossil fuels. But that's a bit of a sense there. And won't that look like a sort of historical thing? $7.5 billion surplus in 2019. So in 2019, the government took $7.5 billion more out of the economy than it put in, put back in, and left it to the private sector to make up the difference. This year, of course, is going to be radically different, and perhaps for some years to come. Our working age population is about 2.6 million, and that 77% figure is the share of the population that is employed. And, New Zealand is right up there. We have a very high share. I think we're in the top 5 or whatever of the, advanced nations in terms of the share of our population, working age population, that is actually employed. Now, you can look at that as a good or a bad thing, but we're right up there. We work longer, and we work, and more of us work. The total unemployed was 110,000, about 4%. Now, that is the figure that we're seeing rise, and we're going to see rise very significantly. I think it's already risen by 20 or 30, 40,000. That's the people who register as unemployed. And just to give you, again, some perspective, the worst we've seen in the last half century or more, or in fact almost the last century getting up for it, was that 1991, that period where the worst of the neoliberal clearing of the decks happened, where we got up to 10.7% unemployed. If what's happening now leads to something similar, then we are confronted with perhaps another 200,000 people on the dole, and maybe it'll go beyond that. I also just put that figure in there. We're also, another of the areas, we're also one of the lowest by way down in the share of government employment compared to private employment. So the government's share of our total employed is about 13%. The OECD average is about 21%. So arguably, without even becoming big government, there's room for more direct government spending, employment. And of course, if we're looking at an activist government, that generally requires more resources, more people, more ability to act and lead, as opposed to sort of nudge and cajole and regulate the private sector. On the other front, where is the carbon? As we're looking for those environmental projects, this is again just an indication of where we're going to be looking to remove carbon from the economy. And obviously the biggie there, agriculture and energy is next. And really that's it, agriculture and energy from our point of view. There's a little bit of an industrial process, and I guess if we become more of a manufacturing nation, maybe that'll go up rather than go down. And ditto waste, particularly if we do a lot more building and so on. But again, those are areas. And that last one, land use and land use change and forestry is, I guess, is a net reducer of carbon. And with more land use change, potentially a significant reducer of carbon. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the areas that are, are being looked at in these various sectors. When I did a sort of a quick compare, and you'll see a link, well, a reference to a link, you won't be able to click on it, on the bottom of the screen, comparing Green New Deals in the EU, UK and US. The areas they fell into broadly the areas on this screen and the next. So climate change, which is that kind of decarbonising aspect of the environment. Electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging networks, tree planting, and actually we shouldn't forget urban design is a potentially major impact, both in terms of decarbonising and actually in terms of our own lives and social and community existence. And maybe again an area where potentially we can be improving both at the same time. In the environment, obviously the clean air and water is a biggie here. On the topic of land use changes, farming, and including maybe more crops and fewer animals, perhaps, and that whole area of rewilding of spaces. In some cases, particularly if they've been perhaps brought into marginal production and would be better, rewilded and left to a more natural state for all the other benefits in terms of the wildlife and other aspects of the ecosystem that are also being threatened. So environment. Now I know in our group there's been a very keen debate about the one that isn't on there, which is hydrogen. But hydro, wind, tidal, solar, definitely areas that make a lot of sense for us here. And hydrogen is a very interesting area that some think is a terrific opportunity, both in terms of environmental gains and in terms of a potential export industry for New Zealand. And in the infrastructure areas, particularly, again, this is looking at the decarbonising of the economy as much as building the essential physical infrastructure that we need. But housing, both in terms of building more housing and public housing in this case, but also making those houses much more energy efficient. And in many cases retrofitting, a lot of retrofitting, which we've already started here. And transport changes and 5G, I guess, that we're looking at, and particularly now that we're all Zooming and we're looking at a much more, a world that's more likely to be virtually connected rather than physically connected for a period of time. Maybe more rapid rollouts of some of the digital infrastructure is something that we should be throwing into that mix for the big infrastructure spending. And that would also have benefits in terms of the decarbonising. So other examples were jobs and, 4-day week. So, and actually picking up on your point, Jill, the consumerism that we have got into is an aspect of our lives that where we perhaps need to sort of take stock and say, maybe what we need is more money, more time, less stuff. And certainly that was something that the Corbynites campaigned very heavily on in the last UK election, the whole idea of a 4-day week, and maybe it needs to be complemented by, you know, getting back to a 5-day, you know, 7 till 7 p.m., 7 a.m., 7 p.m. shopping hours routine, or something to really kind of nudge the whole change to people's lifestyle that allows them to gain time as one of the paybacks for gains in other areas. A job guarantee, which again was in the Sanders type proposal and has been floated around for some years, and we'll talk about that later on as well, because we've been doing some thinking in that area, and just transition measures in order to ensure that those sunset industries, the workers from those sunset industries, and indeed the sunset industries themselves, are able to transition to a more carbon-friendly economy without the kind of social devastation that we saw last time we went through this upheaval. You know, in the industrial area, and again, picking up on that point, Jill, that you were making about, well, you know, people are starting to understand that maybe we've become too global, too reliant on others, too reliant on importing things that we used to and could make ourselves. Maybe that's an area that we need to look at. If any of you are fans of Mariana Mazzucato's work on, you know, the entrepreneurial state and so on, the whole area of, you know, the government getting back into the business of, as they continue to tell us, picking winners, but being the investor of first resort, the one that kickstarts markets when the private sector is too shy, but when we know there is urgency. This has actually been a traditional role of government. We've seen it as, you know, energy infrastructure has been put in place, as, you know, TV channels, you know, when you know, radio and TV and so on just became new and nobody wanted to sort of build the network without the sets out there or whatever. The government steps in, does it as the investor of first resort, and then, you know, potentially hands over to the private sector and certainly de-risks a lot of what's happening. And that often goes hand in hand with, you know, big increases in public research and public, you know, basic research, not necessarily all aimed at specific commercializing. The private sector can commercialize, but, you know, a lot of that long-term basic research needs to be done by the public, because we've seen the private sector is not very good or willing. And indeed, maybe the circular economy, where you have, you know, where the actual total life cycle costs of goods are actually built into it and have to be paid for at the point of manufacture and distribution and so on. That is both good economically and could potentially add a lot more of the value that's extracted from that product in terms of in our local manufacturing and service industries. And I see even in the EU, where the circular economy is part of their Green Deal, you know, things like carbon tax at the border, where you're also, you know, maybe not getting back to the complete, you know, import licensing and so on, but you're recognizing that if the goods are coming in and they haven't met maybe carbon or perhaps labor related requirements, you know, you can level the playing field. And on the international front, again, that how we interface with the world, that carbon border tax we were just talking about is a potential area. And another one, of course, in our neighborhood, you know, the whole issue of climate refugees, and maybe this is the time to be putting those policies in place and getting the groundwork laid before we actually find these refugees having to get on boats and come over here in vast numbers without that framework in place. And we all know what happens when the debates happen under that duress. And finally, on the money side is the other area that is, you know, a key part of these Green New Deal ideas. And really, the way we've managed money and the way we've been talked into thinking about money has been a significant source of the problems that have been created. You know, we've given a lot more power to private capital, and we've taken away a lot of the power of the public and the democratically elected politicians and public to control our own money. And there's a lot that can be done in that area. We'll again look at an example later on, and Gerald was alluding to it in his point as well. Things like monetizing the debt, and also areas of fixing the financial system's problems. We allow ourselves to get into a situation where 4 banks control 90% of our entire financial sector. Maybe there's opportunities to diversify banking, as there has been in the past, and as there is in successful economies like the German economy, where 40% of the banking market is held in things like public and cooperative banks and local banks that deal with businesses not as numbers and algorithms, but as people, where they can assess business risk, where they deal with people wanting to buy their homes in their communities without having to, without being incentivized to try and sell them too much credit to push up the prices of those properties in that community. So there's a lot that can be done in that area to both give us the means for the more activist role and a more, you know, a larger, more substantial group of public services, and to make you know, the requirement to constantly get onto the debt treadmill less, and that's for both the public and the households. Okay, so the question I'd like us to kind of discuss, having just sort of given a bit of a run through of some of the ideas that are out there and some of the possible, is you know, we may or may not be able to do everything. Wouldn't it be great if we can do everything? But I think what's often good is to think about what is it that we need to double down on. What are the 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 big things, really big things that could make shift things massively? You know, a policy that can really get into the engine room and push out and fundamentally change how we're doing things. And in thinking about that, going back to our Green New Deal principles there, does it deliver on both the environment and social transformation? Is what we're proposing something that will actually allow us to use that opportunity to fix those 2 crises? I'm going to stop sharing the screen and open up to discussion. Any thoughts on what we should be doubling down on? You know, if we're going to be throwing out policies and trying to make a real difference, what is it that we should be doubling down on? Brett, you've got your hand up.
I haven't actually, but
okay. From previously, probably. Okay. Anyone have any thoughts or comments on the those kind of areas? By the way, those areas, I noticed when I kind of added them up, and I was sort of looking at them from analysing what was happening overseas, but the you know, 2/3 of our government spending is actually not in those areas. They're in things like social care and you know, the social welfare system, the health system, the education system, which is you know, 2/3 out of our government spending. Jill?
No, it's not me, it's Len.
Oh, okay, Len.
Hi, look, Len Richards here. I just wanted to say one idea that was the centre of the New Deal. One of the things that they did was the big, it was the conservation course, you know, where, you know, we should, particularly with younger people and lack of employment opportunities, perhaps in the tourist industry, we could replace that with a whole massive, you know, we've got the zero, you know, getting rid of all the pests in the native bush, getting, building, you know, planting 1 billion trees. There's plenty of work cleaning up the rivers, the lakes, and all that. I mean, there's huge amounts of effort needed in that side of, you know, things, conservation course. So, but just one other thing too, on the reason why equality in the environment and economics and the environment, or social change in the environment are linked, is because the court, you know, it's the overall, now the capitalist system operates. It's a common cause, so we have to actually get to the to that cause and change the way we, you know, we're talking about the consumerist society, the advertising, the waste, you know, that goes on, the military waste, and so on. You know, more. I agree. Less stuff, more time.
Thanks. I'll just go. I'll come back, Robert. Barry, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yes, everybody. I thought it was a little rude to be anonymous as one project, so thank you very much. Hey,
Right.
just firstly, Martin, that's some really cool conversation, and thank you for putting this all together for us. I just wanted to say one thing with Sunset Industries. I think we're quite fixated on fossil fuel and the like, but I think we need to broaden that definition, because with the amount of artificial intelligence and automation that's coming into the workplace now and in the future, there's going to be a vast number of people who are employment refugees, who are no longer able to get work, and they need to be part of that just transition as well. And I think we need to be thinking for tomorrow's roles, not just for today's, as to who needs that care and support. Because with any loss of purpose, which is a job, you lose identity, and that brings a whole lot of mental health issues as well. One of the areas I thought would be quite important for this new economy, or this new Green Deal, would be a decentralization or a democratization of innovation. And one of the things I see is that we can easily, as a young 18-year-old, go and get vast student loans to throw ourselves into a course or a degree or some kind of profession that we might not even know we want. But then if someone wishes to have an idea and develop that into a startup, finding pre-seed capital is almost near impossible, unless you're in a small stream or channel that puts you into the right places for that. But if someone could access $10,000 at a low interest rate for a pre-seed round of investment, of course it's, you check and you have to go through some hoops to qualify. It might just open up and broaden the amount of innovation New Zealand can throw out there, if we want to move into sort of more of that knowledge economy, green space. And I'm always concerned about people holding up the circular economy as a holy grail, because every time you reiterate those raw materials that you used in the prior product, it involves energy. So each time you take those raw materials from the waste and turn them into something usable, you're again using energy. I'm just conscious of us holding it up too highly, because we are just effectively kicking the can for that waste problem down the timeline to the next generation potentially. So that's just something I wanted to make us all aware of. And lastly, in terms of your last question, what do we need to double down on? I think, as we've seen with this last month to 5 weeks of COVID-19, we need to double down on empathy and compassion. If we let that cloak and be the guiding light for any policy and any type of regulation of industry or support of community, I think we'll come up with a far better understanding of what we are as a people and what we can have as a nation tomorrow. Because unfortunately with neoliberal economics, the challenge with that was that it removed morals and ethics from anything to do with the free market. So we're going to have to go through this recovery from globalization and recovery from, I guess, in a way, a theft of our identity as people to just be consumers. So there's a lot there to go through, but I think this conversation is brilliant. So thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. So Sharon and then David.
Thank you. Yeah, no, lovely conversation. Look, I'm just going to combine a couple of things from before as well. I mean, I think we can see the value of the socialist agenda, and that's coming more to the forefront of people's minds, that they, the benefit of the welfare state and the opportunity to see things differently from a social perspective. I think there's a slight disconnect in relation to your second set of questions between the kinds of conversations we were having and the needs people have got at the moment. So I think we somehow need to bring those two things together, because much as we're talking about these different things and the opportunity for change, the things that I'm seeing on the ground in terms of Auckland Council's behaviour, Ports of Auckland's behaviour, large corporations, is that there's like a vertical integration and consolidation of power. So for example, McDonald's is doing the best out of the return to takeaways. Auckland Council has axed pretty much all their environmental projects, bar one or two. So people are saying they're interested in the environment. Meanwhile, all the people who are working in the environment are losing their jobs in favour of shovel-ready projects, which seem to involve large infrastructure and, again, money going to corporates to put that large infrastructure in. So I think it's about attacking it where people can actually see that change makes a difference. So it's supporting, and I think we need some more buzzwords that connect with that more, and to tap into the zeitgeist. And I think those things are localization, really pushing a localization agenda, and then combining that with things like what you were saying about the banks, you know, looking for those opportunities to beef up things that already exist, like Kiwi Bank or the Cooperative Bank, and supporting those things so that more money flows locally. In relation to what Barry was saying, I think, yes, it's all about the seed funding, but then it's also how do we take those projects to market so that we don't have to sell them overseas to someone who has got more money, but that we're actually, you know, got more funds to actually develop those things and take them to market within our own country so that we reap the benefits of that. Yeah. So I think, and I think that consolidation is a real threat. We're seeing it in farming. I've just been told by Ports of Auckland they're expecting it in shipping. Therefore, they want to dredge more deeply in the Rangitoto Channel because they're expecting that there will be fewer shipping companies with bigger boats delivering. So I think those are real threats that we need to be aware of. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharon. And actually, just picking up on a couple of the points you made there, it's interesting, you know, tying the money and the industrial marketing together. You know, the first Labor government, when it created the state advances to fund housing, used the same process to create marketing organisations. You know, the Dairy Board for the agricultural and industrial marketing. For the overseas, to support the overseas exporters. It was a very conscious and resourced and financially resourced effort. David.
I don't know if I've got sound yet, have I?
Yep, good as gold.
Hey.
Yeah.
Two quick things. One, it's just fantastic to see so many familiar faces, and wonderful, Martin, that you've pulled together this group. And thank you so much for the slide pack and the initiative. Some really good quality thinking, I reckon, coming through. And now is the hour. I just want to toss in a couple of pretty broad thoughts and an encouragement. The broad thoughts are that, as Morgan Godfrey wrote, I think that there's been an interregnum of political ideas in the years preceding the COVID-19 crisis, largely since the GFC. Put simply, the neoliberal ideology has increasingly lost its persuasive power and it is ebbing, but it is not clear what the alternative is or has been going to look like. And the left has not won that battle. The vacuum of ideas has been filled by the far right, encouraged or manipulated by the security services of some totalitarian states and some pretty sophisticated data manipulation, all sorts of things. But whether we like it or not, Trump is just one of a new breed of anti-scientific far-right ideologues that have filled an ideas vacuum around the globe, and it's incredibly dangerous. And anybody who reckons you need to inject granola to get over coronavirus shouldn't be leading a country, and I wouldn't want him leading my play centre. I mean, it's ridiculous. So never waste a good crisis. I reckon, as some other speakers have said, this is the best chance a resurgent left has had for a generation. Because the frame has been broken and the old rules, for example, New Zealand's own fiscal responsibility parameters, are out the window in a jiffy because they have to be. We've already invested 4% of GDP in stimulus so far. We've got another 1 to 2 coming through the infrastructure investment wave. But compare that to Roosevelt's New Deal in the 30s, 2 waves of 6 and 8% of GDP investment. And although that wasn't a Green New Deal because the planet hadn't reached its environmental limits, it was a broad-based New Deal that did take on the bastions of financial power. It did re-regulate the economy. It did bring in a comprehensive welfare state, and it did put people to work, including planting trees. So the lessons for us are that necessity creates opportunity, and that, as everybody here has, I think, agreed, our agenda has to cover both social and environmental and economic imperatives. They have to be integrated into a prioritized program that is evidence-based and workable. And what I really like about your slide pack, Martin, is that you have put some quants in there to give us a sense of magnitude. No government can do everything. They haven't got the mental bandwidth or the ability to delegate 1 million projects. And if this team can start to sift through, with your help, some of the many ideas around to suggest some priorities to our government that they might pursue in the Green New Deal space, that would be fantastic. And with due respect to our wonderful colleagues in the Green Party, the Green Jobs Package, which was basically $1 billion for conservation and other associated jobs, is not it, because it is not systemic. It does not change the fundamental operation of the economy. And until we do that, the rest of it is blowing in the wind. We have to address the economic fundamentals of how it works. I reckon it'll be a new Keynesianism, and I reckon it'll be, here's my word, a new glocalism. It won't be like old localism, because we'll still have the internet and we'll have access to information like we are today. We'll be able to zoom in and meet each other around the country. But we will care about our individual communities, our whānau, our iwi, and we will buy and consume food and products locally where we can, and we'll have more resilient supply chains. We just need to make sure it's damn sight less carbon emitting. And New Zealand has probably the first best opportunity in the world to be a beacon of hope here. People are already looking to us for how well we've come together around this. Just imagine we could back that up with best of breed ideas that showed the way forward to the future. What an exciting place that would be for New Zealand and for the New Zealand Labour Party. So thank you, Martin, and thank you to the group.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's much appreciated. John, you've had your hand up for a bit. Is John there?
Yep. Just get unmuted. Priority I see is to increase the incomes of the people at the bottom is a major priority, and at the same time reduce their rents. And reducing the rents is the government can affect demand, supply, and affect the rent in that way. So rent should be down to the 25-30% of income. That's my point, basically.
Thank you, John. Absolutely spot on. Bruce. Do you want to unmute, Bruce?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good to go.
I'm sorry. Yeah. The first issue that I want to raise is local government. Local government, you would have thought, was about supporting local communities. Local government in New Zealand has done absolutely nothing that I know of to help resolve the issues arising out of this COVID-19 crisis. None of them has taken a pay cut. None of them has restructured or reoriented the way their workforce works. They simply sit there on their backsides in their offices as they always did. I want to see central government do something about the absolutely shameful performance of local government in this crisis. The second thing, which is a point that many of you will know, is that it's very easy to talk about a hydrogen economy being a very exciting alternative to oil. But let me tell you something that some of you will know and others won't. If you spill hydrogen, you lose it forever, because hydrogen molecules are traveling at what's called escape velocity at the surface of the Earth. So if you burst a hydrogen cylinder and it doesn't burn, all of your hydrogen goes into space. Now, if we start on a hydrogen economy and don't put the proper restrictions in place, we will kill ourselves and everything else on the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Vanushi.
Sure. I think for me, I'm really conscious of what is the value versus the concern of framing things as a crisis. My sense is that that gives power for others to decide when the crisis ends. and potentially then put up some new solutions instead. And I think that's what we're seeing in terms of the National Party's call for a move back to BAU. And so I think for me, if there is a big change that we could focus on right now, it's really about shifting language from a crisis of inequality to the assertion of the realisation of human rights. I mean, right now, our domestic human rights legislation is just very loosely tethered to international law, when really, if we wanted to assert those rights, as opposed to saying we're just responding to a crisis, we would look at domesticating, for example, the articles within the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Convention, Article 6, the right to work, Article 7, the right to fair and decent work, so that we are truly looking at the start of, I guess, decades of change as opposed to a short-term crisis response. And I think a lot of the things that you've listed, I'm really attracted to. I think for me particularly, the jobs for all idea. But I think, again, if we're going to present that as a future-focused, decades-long manifesto of change, it needs to be underpinned by a philosophy that we can easily explain to the public. And I'm always quite drawn to Kate Raworth's donut economics model. But I do think, as opposed to choosing one or two, this is the opportunity to do something long-lasting.
Thank you, Venushi, much appreciated. Rajiv.
Thank you. I think to answer your question about what we should double down on, I have difficulty doing that, Martin, because there's so many great ideas coming out the discussion today itself. I just want to make two cross-cutting points quickly. The first is that I think we need to think carefully about how such a major transformation would be paid for. There's going to be a cost. And the financial architecture to which we are very dependent now for the last so many decades is something which will also see the transformation. And therefore, we'll have to figure that out, how to raise the capital to pay for all this big change. Second point I wanted to make is the politics of the way this is presented. I think one of the lessons from the US, for example, is that if we present this whole change agenda as, let's say, a political argument or ideological argument, we might end up losing support. And I think we have to think carefully how we present this narrative so that we get political consensus from across the spectrum. And one way of doing that is to focus on what and how rather than ideology. It's just a thought.
Thanks, Rajiv. That's excellent points. So thanks for those comments. Let's now move on a little bit. So again, just bear with me for one moment while I flip into screen sharing mode. Okay. Right, hopefully you'll see that slide. This is just a little bit of context, and we've actually been touching on these points because I guess one of the things we want to be thinking about is, what will the changes be in the post-COVID-19 world, and which, if any, will last. And I know actually several of them were highlighted in some of the conversations, for example, Jill and Barry and others. But arguably the trend against globalization has been happening for a while. I guess we've certainly all seen examples of this, but it's a hard one to change. It is possible, perhaps, that a crisis, which actually is a crisis at many levels in global connections, might hypercharge that shift away from globalization in a number of areas. and one that I didn't put in there, which again we'll touch on later on and has been raised several times, is also financial capital, which is part of that globalization. So are we going to see the kind of shift to local production, maybe import substitution, for example, that will feel long-term enough for businesses to invest in? Because that's really going to be the key. What's their perception going to be? The points that have been made about how entrenched the consumerism is are, show that a return to business as usual driven by consumerism would be definitely on the cards. But on the other hand, the pause and change of lifestyle that people have actually experienced that memory may be quite long lasting. So travel and capital restrictions, some of these are also obviously going to reflect dramatic shifts in the economy itself. And we already know that tourism and international education are going to be two very big foreign exchange earners that will have to shrink and somehow either be replaced by more foreign earnings or fewer foreign purchases. So another potential biggie, how long lasting will this be? Trust in government, because, one of the things we know has really been instrumental in the whole neoliberal push was its success in undermining trust in government. And there's never really been an opportunity to restore it, not in my recollection. Even the action taken post-GFC wasn't government action. It was central bank action, and in the countries where it was most conspicuous, in the Northern Hemisphere countries, the accompanying government reaction was actually negative. It was austerity, whether that was the Brits or the Europeans, not so much the Americans, but certainly the Brits and the Europeans. It was central bank largesse and public austerity. So again, and in our own country, while I don't think we've got quite the same levels of distrust, we have deep-seated distrust. So could that be a long-lasting change? And if so, does that help us in putting forward policies that require the return of a more activist state? Because certainly without that activist state, having to rely on the nudging and cajoling of the private sector, no matter how sustainably minded and so on they are becoming, is still often slow and difficult and never quite perhaps goes as far as it should. And I guess the final point is we're about to all experience shrinking economies. What happens? Is it time to live within our ecological means? Is it time to live within, to accept that we should accept more time and less stuff as the trade-off? Is that permanent or is that temporary? So let me leave that question in your minds. What are the changes to the narrative, to people's thinking that COVID-19 has produced, and which, if any, are likely to be permanent and embedded? Robert. You're on mute, Robert.
I still want to keep in mind the double downing. By that I mean, what the question you're asking is, what are the key priorities that this group should be pushing? That's what I understand by double downing, okay? The first thing I would say is that one of the things that we should concentrate on is not just going to green shovel projects, but we need to put in place processes that enable all projects to be evaluated according to certain criteria. So the government has the 4 capitals, it's got living standards. We should say that any money that is going to be put into the economy by the government should go through that framework. That's an existing framework. It's got some limitations, but it's there. So rather than just push projects, I would push processes. And another example of that is that the collapse of the mine, Pike Mine, led to a change in the Companies Act for the liability of company directors to be responsible for health and safety. They became personally liable. We should make the Companies Act such that company directors are responsible for fitting into the 4 capitals. In other words, make them responsible for identifying and reporting on their environmental and ecological footprint. That's a process thing that can stand. The second point that I think is a really important doubling down is that there are going to be more catastrophes around the corner. That this is just the first of a number, and that we should start preparing for that. So, and just let me give you one example. There was a report, I think it was in The Guardian recently, about a military disaster analysis that had been done in Australia. And the lady who was in the military is now working outside of that, and that's now public. And what she did is she got all peak groups, engineers from all the sectors together. And one of the most interesting examples was to do with water. Now, water is dependent in Australia, the water quality, on various chemicals that come from China. And they come from China, the raw product goes to China and various other countries, and then it eventually gets to Australia, okay? And they were running short of it. So what they were saying was, so this is my second point, is that we need to prepare for the next catastrophe. And as part of that process, we need to look at our supply chains. Now, the supply chains are going to change because one of the readings that I come out of the COVID-19 catastrophe is that the global chains are in fact China supply chains. So I believe that over the next year or two, there'll be a lot of countries looking at their supply chains to diversify and to become more local. That will mean greater costs, but that's just one example of, I'm not sure, but I think all the light bulbs in New Zealand come from China. So I would be wanting to say, what are the things that we should be pushing for? I think that we should be pushing for processes that are incorporated in legislation and government responsibilities to monitor and regulate, e.g. 4 capitals. And secondly, I think that we should start asking the government to do a disaster plan for the next catastrophes and how we are going to cope.
Thanks, Robert. 2 absolutely excellent points and proposals there. The point about disaster planning reminded me also when you were talking about, all the light bulbs in China or from China. Like in the in the tech industry and the semiconductor industry, there's the second sourcing, right? You don't build a processor into your item if you can't get it from at least one other source. And I wonder if that's an area that can kind of play into us as well, because more places will be looking for more alternative suppliers who might not have in the past, and we'll just sort of keep them ticking along so that they're there for a crisis. Mike, you've had your hand up for a little while.
Yeah, just a few things. I think issues of time and place and location are going to be important. I think things are going to get worse before they get better, and here is around the world. And so we need to, I think we should focus very closely on our own situation, what's happening right here and now and coming at us, because we have a bit of a international advantage, it seems to me, in terms of how we have so far managed our way through this crisis. So I think kind of we need to think in the short term, look at what's actually going to happen and what's going to happen here. And the first priority should be policies that we can devise that will see us through the next 6 months or so, and put the frameworks in place for what we might want to do further on.
Thanks, Mike. Matt and Camilla, and then we'll move on. Thanks.
Sounds good. Great. Thanks, Martin. I would just say that I'm hearing a lot of broad consensus around the principles of wanting to make these kinds of changes in terms of a Green New Deal and addressing inequality. And I think but there's a broad range of proposals, in terms of the strands that should consist of. I think what would be useful, and there are the makings of it in the presentation, would be some analysis of the causes and drivers of the climate problem and of inequality. And then from that, of course, spins out the proposals to address those areas. If, for example, the main contributor of carbon in the environment is the agriculture industry, then you can drill down deeper into which parts of it are causing that, and then start to look at some sort of solutions that address that. That, of course, protect people's livelihoods as best as possible, that there's sufficient political support for, and so on. And I think here that the point that David made was a very good one in terms of the need now for the left to frame that somehow in a coherent way, because they sort of have reached the end of the pavement in a way. I think the person who's leading, in my view, most promisingly in terms of suggestions for what comes next for the left is actually Tony Blair, but it would be a very brave progressive to point to Tony Blair for solutions to society's problems these days. But again, I think that question of, well, where does the left go next, also could be anchored in that causal analysis. What's the analysis of the causes and drivers of the problems we're seeing? And then from that provides the roots upon which the sort of solutions and strategy emanates.
Thank you, Matt. Much appreciated. Camilla.
Hi, it's Camilla here. I just wanted to go back to your initial slide, I think, when you had the definition of the Green New Deal up, and the analysis not only on addressing climate issues, but also on inequalities. And I think you asked at the beginning of this discussion session what's changed in relation to the Green New Deal following the COVID crisis. And I think one of the areas that has changed is probably public perception and the respect for the work that people do. I don't think that necessarily is reflected by employers. I mean, I work for a union, and I've seen them, use a lot of the COVID situation as an excuse to make people redundant and lower the rights that they have. But I think generally there's a respect for and an understanding that a job that needs doing is a job worth having, and an increased respect on those lower paid jobs. And so I think when we think about how we are to implement the inequality side or addressing inequality side of a Green New Deal, that's something that maybe we could really use to our advantage. And also another thing I just wanted to pick up from the chat was, it seems from this group anyway, moving forward, there's a general consensus that whatever the Green New Deal looks like, or whatever the government does, it needs to be in a strong partnership with mana whenua and with unions. So I thought that, moving forward, that's probably just a good thing to note down at this point. Thanks.
Thanks, Camilla. Much appreciated. We'll just take one more, Phil, but we'll definitely have to move on at that point. Phil.
Yeah, look, my comment was just picking up on something that Matt said about the principles that we use going forward. I have this attitude towards the universal benefit, where I think it'd be a great idea if it was a universal benefit, but it wasn't universal, because in a way, universal is too broad. We don't need more universalism for pensioners, for example, in the sense that they've already got a superannuation scheme, which if other people in the economy could have even that much, they'd be grateful. And on the other hand, I think the word income also in the concept of a UBI needs to be broadened out to say that it doesn't have to be just a lump sum of money. It can actually be access to free services and a whole bunch of things, so that we don't have to think about some of these things in the future in terms of just how they fit our model, but how they could imaginatively fit our circumstances.
Thanks, thanks, Phil. That's much appreciated. I'm going to move on now to the last segment. We've got 25 minutes, so time for a small amount of chatter from me and plenty of discussion from everybody here. So the next phase, I'm just going to put out a couple of ideas that could potentially make a big difference here in New Zealand, and on which there's a little bit of momentum. So let me just do the quick screen share, and then we'll move on to the discussion. Okay, so one of them is this idea of a job guarantee that we've talked about, and this particular group's also been doing a bit of work on to try to think through how that might work in New Zealand. And the idea is a job guarantee, you know, and indeed the end of unemployment, well, certainly the end of involuntary unemployment is actually a genuine and achievable goal. What is that something we can achieve, and is that the sort of deep systemic lasting change that could really make a difference? So what is a job guarantee? Well, it's a guaranteed job, and guaranteed means no matter who you are, where you are, or what skills you have, because an awful lot of jobs are people are precluded who want to work from those kinds of things. It is paid for by the government, but it's not a government job in the traditional sense of, you know, you've joined the public service and you're on the and you're in the public service system with, you know, there for life or what have you. But it's paid for by the government, but delivered by central and local government, Maori and community groups and non-profits. So you'll notice business is lacking from that delivery vehicle, but community groups, community-focused groups are definitely in there. It's voluntary. It sits alongside the dole option. It's not a forced work regime. You do it if you want to do it, and if you don't do it, the current options remain. It's transitional. So this job guarantee it's transitional because it's there until the private sector jobs open up and start hiring again, because the private sector has been conspicuous in its lack of filling the gap. We've had this notion that unemployment is 4 to 5% is natural, and in fact the economists call it the natural level of unemployment or similar terms. But actually there's nothing natural about it, and even in New Zealand's history for 30 years after the war there was less than 1% unemployment. So 4%, 5% unemployment is not natural, and it can be eradicated. So because it's transitional, the idea is that the guarantee is that there's always a job, but that job is there, and hopefully not there for a life, hopefully there until a public or private sector employer offers a job that suits your skills, location, aptitude, and career aspirations. But what it does do is supports the private sector very heavily, because there's very few things worse than trying to get somebody working and upskilled when they're sitting at home on the dole, divorced from their community, and demeaned. So this is the exact opposite. This is having a group of people who are ready to work, ready to be hired by the private sector when the jobs are there. And this kind of thing, unlike things like, as we were discussing with things like the green jobs, as in Green Party jobs thing, this is a permanent feature of the way the economy is managed. We'll talk in the next segment about fiscal versus monetary tools, but the reality is the way the economy works, it needs government stimulus, and this is potentially a great either replacement or addition to the current way that we manage our economy, the ups and downs of our economy and its pricing and inflation pressures, by using that obscure tool of the OCR, the interest rate on central bank reserves. So we're basically managing the employment, managing the economy within with employment, not unemployment. And the thing is, this is actually not an unachievable thing from a cost point of view. If we look back at the last decade, for example, where we've had about 100,000 people unemployed, about 4% unemployment, and we compare that to the 1% unemployment that the 30 years post-war it would cost around about 1% of GDP to solve that problem, to eliminate unemployment and ensure that full employment really means a job for everyone who wants one. Now, 1%, David gave some numbers earlier on about just the stimulus packages that are being put out by the government currently, by the sorts of percentages of GDP that the New Deal itself, the original one, had. And 1% of GDP it's a lot, but it's not unachievable. And the thing about a job, as we know, and employment and more money coming into a household and more dignity, is that it is much more than a job. Possibly it's the single biggest thing that we can do as a society to address some of these well-being issues. And because it's designed as a transitional job program with socially useful work, and it's not rubbish work, it's up to us to be thinking of work that has genuine social and community benefit. But it also provides the perfect forum to get people ready for work, to help with transition, to help with upskilling and retraining that's required as industries transition, as new industries come, as the whole new green jobs field opens up. So we're able to help people into work rather than have them sitting at home expecting them to get off their asses and somehow figure out how to do it. And really, this chart just sort of says it, doesn't it? You know, we've done it before. Why can't we do it again? Other than the fact that the economists told us that the natural rate of unemployment in New Zealand is 4 to 5%. It's not, and it doesn't have to be, and it hasn't been for long periods of time. So let me just stop screen sharing for just a moment, and any questions or comments on that for a few minutes? This is a policy that we've sort of, well, actually we launched on, believe it or not, the International Workers' Day, May Day, you know, for our Northern Hemisphere colleagues, Labour Day, yesterday. But it is an area that is potentially both hugely transformative and systemic, in the sense that we can embed it into the economic fabric. Any thoughts or discussion? We haven't got Brett.
Oh, hi. I think the things that appeal to me about it are that it is, to use a phrase, shovel ready, and things could be done pretty quickly through, in terms of the immediate crisis, through councils and the like, depending on what it was. It has real opportunities, I think, for advancing the well-being of regions, and maybe it needs to be built around climate change issues.
Yeah.
And at the back of my mind there, or at the forefront of it, is Rob Carr's Climate Commission report that really spelled all that out. You know, focusing on transport, social housing, solar, water infrastructure, and low-lying infrastructure. Those were the big things that climate change need do. So recommend we focus on. So if all of those things can be assisted through a job guarantee, then that might be part of it. I'm seeing a question mark raised about it by existing businesses that are struggling, and they'll say, get us going, and we'll take up the slack. So, an interesting, depending how it's solved.
Yeah, and definitely it's there until they do pick up the slack, and the sooner they do, the happier everyone will be. Rajiv.
Thank you, Martin. You know, when he first discussed this idea, I think some weeks back, the question in my mind at that time was the cost of this. And I think now you've answered that. The 1% of GDP looks like a very, very affordable cost to do this. So two related points, I think. One is, would it be worthwhile piloting this for some specific sectors? Because as a general concept, it sounds very nice, but there may be specific sector biases or requirements for which there may be some lessons to be learned there. And the second thing is this jobs guarantee thing might also allow us to expand a little bit the idea of social enterprises, where we get some work done without the profit motive. And that is something which I think is something for which we haven't fully explored the potential in the country yet.
Yes.
Just some thought.
Thanks, Rajiv. I'll just take one more, Barry, and then we'll move on.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, Rajiv, I love that you said that, you know, that comes down to the whole metric of what is value. You know, we're wanting to give people money because we see that as delivering a quality of life, but in fact, what money delivers you a quantity of life. And that's the whole problem, is we've got this narrative of quantity of life equals happiness, but actually quality of life equals happiness. And I think that's really based around purpose that you find in a job, not always the money that you find in a job. So that's just one point there. But I do feel, I can't help but feel that it shouldn't only be the responsibility of government to actually catch people who are displaced from work. I think we have to look at our industry and our commerce and say, hang on a second, you also have an obligation to respect and nurture and look after people that have helped your business grow into a successful business. And now that you have the means or the technology to remove them from your business, why should they be treated worse than the raw materials that you use in your business? So the same way we have a circular economy for raw materials, we have less of a care for the people that get churned through those businesses. So it needs to be a joint effort. I think it needs to be in business. It has a change of how they treat the human factor in their operation, and also then at a governmental level to catch and support and reintroduce to the workplace.
Thanks, Barry. Good points. So we're on the home stretch here, 12 minutes. We'll definitely try to meet our commitment, lunch at noon. I'm just going to share my screen again briefly and look at the second idea that's it's not a specific policy area or anything of ours, but it is absolutely out there in the zeitgeist now and is becoming increasingly important as something that we all need to be aware of and start discussing. And it's already been brought up. In fact, I think very first comment, Gerald, thank you for raising that. It's and others. It's how we get to pay for what we need, what we want, and what we need. How we've been told to pay for it in the past, and how we can make choices about how we pay for things in the future. So the second idea, which is out there, is, well, why not pay for it with our own money? And that might seem like a slightly odd thing to say, because we think it is our money, but of course, you know, what is our own money is most of our own money, of course, is created by private financial institutions. In fact, virtually all of it, apart from the 2 or 3% cash that the Reserve Bank physically prints. And that's the way we've chosen to do things. But there's been, even pre-COVID, a huge shift or wave that's been underway for some just in recent years, and this has all been post-GFC, as we've seen you often hear central bank, Reserve Bank conversation about how they're running out of firepower. The interest rates are so low, that's the thing that they've used to apparently manage the economy. for so long is now in the ridiculous territory where it's close to zero and in some cases negative, which suggests that there's no risk in money anymore in lending, and there's certainly no return for savers. So broadly, there are two strands: monetary, which is under the control of the Reserve Bank, and since 1989 here in New Zealand has been exclusively without political interference, the purvey of the Reserve Bank, because we were the leaders in legislating for Reserve Bank independence. And what they manage is money through bank credit. That is to say, the private banks create the new money that we need to grow the economy, and that's managed through the interest rate mechanism, primarily. And of course, the money reaches the economy through bank lending. The alternative, and obviously these things run in parallel, but the other area is fiscal, where the government's direct spending and activity, whether it's spending on infrastructure or public services, getting money into the economy directly through government spending. We've been through a period where the emphasis is on getting money into the economy through the bank channel rather than through the direct government spending channel, and that's had consequences. Excuse me, my voice is disappearing. One of the ways that happened, of course, which David alluded to earlier on as well, is the fiscal responsibility rules that have been part of our public finance regime since the early 90s, where the government's been constrained in its ability to borrow, and it can't create the money, so it's essentially had to shrink relative to the private sector. The total hasn't changed particularly in terms of the total size of the combined two, but the shares have private sector credit, which is the money created by the private sector. You can see as a mirror image of the shrinking money created by the public sector. And along with that is where the capital went, where the money went. So it went, it certainly went into land, inflation and housing, and where it could have gone into schools and hospitals and so on. So, of course, when we come to borrow money, and we're all very proud that we've got the lowest levels of debt in the world, but we've also had the lowest level of debt that New Zealand's had in 150 years, up until very recently, as in weeks and months ago. But the idea that's now floating around is, well, we have a bank that can issue money, at the moment just printed money. Why can't the government borrow from its own bank in the same way households go and borrow from the BNZ or whatever, to pay for everything we're doing? So the debt sits on the Reserve Bank's balance sheet rather than, for example, with overseas lenders, and gives us access to a lot of financial firepower that we may not have had, as well as more control over the terms of that debt and more sovereignty over the terms of that debt. And we can now see, and many of you will have seen that social credit ad, for example, there's a blast from the past, pointing out all the economists here in New Zealand who are now making the very point that perhaps we shouldn't be going begging to the private lenders. The government shouldn't be going begging to the private lenders to fund what we need to do to rebuild our economy and society, but we should be going to our own bank. What's become increasingly clear is that the decision as to why we do things the way we do is not a technical reason. It's not something about the intrinsic nature of money. It's a political reason. It's a political choice we've made, and it's a political choice we can make differently. So monetizing the debt or using the central bank's balance sheet or whatever are all ideas that are floating around, and are something we should perhaps be considering. David, you had your hand up there very early in the piece.
Yeah, look, Martin, I think it's a terrific discussion to have floated. Just want to support the two first points, and then to offer a couple of perhaps questions or qualifications down the back end. The two key points I think you've nailed is firstly that chart you could put it back. It's political. The first point. I think it's something that we need to be concerned about. I think the second point is absolutely right. It is a policy choice. Governments can rely upon domestic credit creation rather than securing that internationally through credit markets. There are probably two caveats to that. The first is that if you took it to its extreme and you printed trillions and trillions of New Zealand dollars and borrowed it from the Reserve Bank, you'd have more and more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services, and that leads to one place. It's called inflation. And if the underlying physical economy is not moving forward, you can have stagnation and inflation, which is stagflation, which is what happened when the Weimar Republic of Germany tried it in the early 1930s. So it has limitations. And the second issue is that we possibly don't need to, because we have to maintain an external balance. We trade a lot. Demand for our goods and services is going to continue, at least in the food and agribusiness sector, probably to continue rising. High quality, secure export lines, and we've been able to continue to do through the COVID crisis. So we're going to need external accounts, and we're going to need to borrow externally probably to some extent. The good news is we've got really, really low debt. One of the lowest government debt system. Well, we've got tons of headroom. We can borrow very, very cheaply at the moment, less than 0.25% per annum. So probably some balance as you ideally come out where we have greater control of our monetary supply. But you don't put all your eggs in the domestic printing basket, because you've got to have an eye on inflation down the track, and you've got to have an eye on external balance and the savings gap. So it's a good discussion, but I just wouldn't want to see us take it too far.
Yeah,
great
okay, thanks, David. Those are good comments, and certainly the key issues are you've still got to have a way of controlling the money creation process, and that's very important. And also the reality is that we do trade with the world. And when we create demand inside our economy, we're also creating demand for those foreign dollars in order to trade. And particularly a lot of the stuff we're talking about now, if you're going to electrify the entire country, you've got some serious imports coming in that we're not going to be making here, and so on. Yazdi, you've had your hand up for a bit. Yazdi, sorry.
Yes, please. So before we close this meeting, I want to thank you, Martin Taylor, for being such a nice host and holding this meeting. And all the people who have attended and made such good contributions. I'm really very happy about it. This meeting has been a very good meeting, and I think with excellent thinkers, and it gives me that we need to form an advisory group and meet again, and maybe you can give it any other good name like Think Mank or anything of that sort, which can process thoughts and then provide a good document which can guide the government and all labor meetings, and also as a society as a whole, for what a comprehensive ethical thinking for future for humanity and the environment can come. And that is what I want to give. Of course, the people, many of the ideas are being thought because people have too much of greed and this non-ethical thinking. But for such people, I think they should realize that a good and a happy society ultimately will mean actually a lot of gain for them also. Sorry, I'm not giving any economy, any suggestion on economy or anything of that sort, but I am very thankful to you and to all the people who attended the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yazdi. And actually, you were giving a comment on the economy. You were telling us what the economy is there for, which is exactly what is often lost. I'll just take one more. Rajiv, you've got your hand up, and then I'm conscious we've hit noon, so we'll part company so you can get some lunch. Rajiv, you've got the final say. That's always nice to have the last word.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with what David articulated earlier. I think that's absolutely right. I was thinking of Zimbabwe as a prime example of where they went the money expansion. You let it go too far, and the whole economy became a wreck because of inflation and stagflation. But the chart that you showed earlier, where the public sector debt is going down and the private sector debt is going up, that does need to be addressed. And I think there may be other ways to address that rise of the private sector debt without sacrificing the current role of the Reserve Bank. So there may be other policy tools we need to look at to see how that can be brought down and the role of private sector banks can be moderated.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And there's a number of ways to do it. And by the way, I'm just working on we have in our ranks an expert on areas of cooperatives, and banking is one of the key areas for cooperatives, along with worker co-ops. And we're looking at putting something together over the next in a few weeks' time on that area of co-ops and how they can actually be used as an alternative organizational and business framework. Okay, well, look, hey, I'm going to call it quits. If anyone wants to save the chat, by the way, because I know there's always heaps of good stuff in there, there's a file or a little menu down the bottom right there if you haven't seen it that you can save. I'll also be saving it so that can distribute it around.
I would like to add to it. I can't get it up. I'd like to answer David.
Oh, okay.
So just leave me a space to do that, okay?
Oh, you mean yes? Well, go ahead now, Mike.
But I don't want to. I'll put it up on the chat. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. So we won't exit the meeting. Yeah. Just I'll let you keep typing away. I'll leave the meeting running just for a few minutes. But anyway, I'll bid you all adieu. Thank you very much for coming along. Great debate. Great thinking as always. Join the chat if you're not already on in our group and on our email list. If I can find it before I exit the meeting, I'll add to the chat the link where you can a form where you can just kind of put in the details we need to come and join our Region 1 Economic Policy Group, just a group of ordinary Labour Party people who think that we need more talking and thinking about the economy and wanting to kind of make it happen. So thanks very much, people. I'll stick that link up there. I don't know if Ron's still with us. He might be able to... Oh, okay, yes, Ron, are you able to paste that form for joining the Region 1 Economic Group?
Probably, if I can find it where I put it.
Yeah, you're very welcome to jump online and we'll keep you in touch with all the stuff that we're doing, and as great discussions going on in there as well. So thanks very much, everybody. Feel free to leave whenever you're ready, and if you want to chat among yourselves for a bit, that's okay as well. But feel free to go and grab some lunch.
Great. Thanks a lot, Martin.
Okay.
Thank you, Martin. Martin, is your slide pack going to be around?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll distribute that. I've got everybody's emails, I think. I'll send a link to the slide pack.
Great. Thank you so much.
I'll also hopefully get an audio of this as well, so that you can get everyone else's contributions as well as that. And the chat. So we'll have a pretty good material here to help us.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you all.
Bye, Martin.
Martin.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Ron, for helping out.
No problem at all. I've got those links saved as well for the chat, but I'll edit them up a bit because it's not always clear who's talking.
Yeah.
And then I'll send it off to you and you can post it out.
Oh, great. Brilliant.
Okie doke. Cheers, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, then. we'll save it till right at the end because there's still chat coming in, and very good. I never get a chance to look at it when I'm doing more talking than I should, so I always enjoy going through it after the recording to see what everyone's got up to with the in the chat. Hi Claire, you're still there, Claire? Claire's going to help us with some ideas. Hey everybody, I've had a slightly flaky internet connection, so I keep dropping out. Yeah. How was that, Joe? Did you enjoy the chat? Right, I'll try ending the meeting because my internet connection is getting very, very dodgy. So we'll see you all later. Yeah, back again with my dodgy internet connection. I'm about to end the meeting so I can get our recording saved. So we'll see you all later on. Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye.
See ya.